Man refuses to help veteran on a shipyard job until he sees his Purple Heart. The sweltering heat of Charleston clung to the shipyard like a heavy blanket, wrapping around the workers who moved in a kind of orchestrated chaos, their movements fluid yet purposeful. The air hummed with the sound of industrial machines, grinding, clanging, and whirring, blending into a cacophony of activity. There was the sharp scent of salt water mixed with the acrid fumes of metal being welded, punctuated by the heavy thuds of steel hitting steel. Ships, colossal in their size and imposing in their presence, sat idle in the harbor, waiting for repairs, their hulls gleaming under the harsh sun as cranes overhead worked like giant metal arms, lifting pieces of equipment or moving massive crates. The noise and the smell of it all were so familiar that they were nearly comforting for those who had spent their lives in this environment. Before we can continue, if you support veterans, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. Among the younger workers, Eddie was a standout. Tall and muscular, with a broad chest and a confident stride, he was someone who moved with purpose, every action measured and precise. At 28, he was one of the best in the yard. His physique had been honed by years of manual labor, and his skills had become second nature to him. Lifting heavy boxes, operating machinery, welding steel, these tasks, which left other men winded or sore by the end of the day, were something Eddie did effortlessly. He was a creature of speed and efficiency, constantly aiming to be the best, to move faster, and work harder than anyone else. And in a yard where physical prowess and skill determined your worth, Eddie was confident he had achieved just that. He had been working at the shipyard since he was 18, straight out of high school. His decision had been easy. He didn't want to go to college, didn't care for the idea of sitting behind a desk. The shipyard offered him something real, something physical. The satisfaction of seeing a job well done, the sweat and effort involved, it appealed to him. It was in his bones, this work. Every day was a race. To move faster, to be stronger, to impress the others around him. He was respected, even admired, by most of the crew, especially the younger guys who looked up to him for his speed and strength. But Eddie didn't look up to anyone. He wasn't interested in stories or advice. He was all about the now, the job in front of him, and the satisfaction of proving he was better than anyone else. The older workers, especially those nearing the end of their careers, were a different matter. Eddie didn't have much patience for them. They moved slower, complained more, and didn't seem to have the same drive he had. He would help them when it was necessary, though he often did it grudgingly. If a job required heavy lifting and one of the older men asked for assistance, Eddie would give a brief nod, offer a helping hand, and then quickly get back to his own work. He didn't see the need to linger on the past or waste time talking about how things were back in the day. He was in the present, and that was enough for him. Eddie had little interest in the war stories, the long-winded recollections of times before he was born. His world was the now, and he was determined to leave all the rest behind. One of the older workers in the yard was Alex. At 70-something, Alex had been working at the shipyard longer than Eddie had been alive. His hair, once dark, was now speckled with gray, and his skin, tanned and weathered by years of labor, was lined with deep creases. The hands that used to be strong enough to build ships were now scarred, and his back, once straight and unyielding, had bent under the weight of decades of hard work. He wasn't as fast as he once had been, nor as strong. He moved with care, aware of the aches in his joints and the weight of age in his bones. But Alex didn't let his physical limitations stop him. He had been through worse in his life. He had seen the horrors of war, survived it, and come out on the other side. The shipyard had always been his refuge, his place of solace after years of trauma. It was where he found purpose, where he could still contribute, even if he had to push himself harder than anyone expected. Alex wasn't the type to ask for help. He was proud of his service in the Vietnam War, proud of his decades of work at the shipyard. He wore his cur purpura, his Purple Heart, on a chain around his neck, but it was rare for him to talk about it. His memories of Vietnam were painful, and he preferred to focus on the man refuses to help veteran on a shipyard job until he sees his Purple Heart. The sweltering heat of Charleston clung to the shipyard like a heavy blanket, wrapping around the workers who moved in a kind of orchestrated chaos, their movements fluid yet purposeful. The air hummed with the sound of industrial machines, grinding, clanging, and whirring, blending into a cacophony of activity. There was the sharp scent of salt water mixed with the acrid fumes of metal being welded, punctuated by the heavy thuds of steel hitting steel. Ships, colossal in their size and imposing in their presence, sat idle in the harbor, waiting for repairs, their hulls gleaming under the harsh sun as cranes overhead worked like giant metal arms, lifting pieces of equipment or moving massive crates. The noise and the smell of it all were so familiar that they were nearly comforting for those who had spent their lives in this environment. Before we can continue, if you support veterans, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. Among the younger workers, Eddie was a standout. Tall and muscular, with a broad chest and a confident stride, he was someone who moved with purpose, every action measured and precise. At 28, he was one of the best in the yard. His physique had been honed by years of manual labor, and his skills had become second nature to him. Lifting heavy boxes, operating machinery, welding steel, these tasks, which left other men winded or sore by the end of the day, were something Eddie did effortlessly. He was a creature of speed and efficiency, constantly aiming to be the best, to move faster, and work harder than anyone else. And in a yard where physical prowess and skill determined your worth, Eddie was confident he had achieved just that. He had been working at the shipyard since he was 18, straight out of high school. His decision had been easy. He didn't want to go to college, didn't care for the idea of sitting behind a desk. The shipyard offered him something real, something physical. The satisfaction of seeing a job well done, the sweat and effort involved, it appealed to him. It was in his bones, this work. Every day was a race, to move faster, to be stronger, to impress the others around him. He was respected, even admired by most of the crew, especially the younger guys who looked up to him for his speed and strength. But Eddie didn't look up to anyone. He wasn't interested in stories or advice. He was all about the now, the job in front of him, and the satisfaction of proving he was better than anyone else. The older workers, especially those nearing the end of their careers, were a different matter. Eddie didn't have much patience for them. They moved slower, complained more, and didn't seem to have the same drive he had. He would help them when it was necessary, though he often did it grudgingly. If a job required heavy lifting and one of the older men asked for assistance, Eddie would give a brief nod, offer a helping hand, and then quickly get back to his own work. He didn't see the need to linger on the past or waste time talking about how things were back in the day. He was in the present, and that was enough for him. Eddie had little interest in the war stories, the long-winded recollections of times before he was born. His world was the now, and he was determined to leave all the rest behind. One of the older workers in the yard was Alex. At 70-something, Alex had been working at the shipyard longer than Eddie had been alive. His hair, once dark, was now speckled with gray, and his skin, tanned and weathered by years of labor, was lined with deep creases. The hands that used to be strong enough to build ships were now scarred, and his back, once straight and unyielding, had bent under the weight of decades of hard work. He wasn't as fast as he once had been, nor as strong. He moved with care, aware of the aches in his joints and the weight of age in his bones. But Alex didn't let his physical limitations stop him. He had been through worse in his life. He had seen the horrors of war, survived it, and come out on the other side. The shipyard had always been his refuge, his place of solace after years of trauma. It was where he found purpose, where he could still contribute, even if he had to push himself harder than anyone expected. Alex wasn't the type to ask for help. He was proud of his service in the Vietnam War, proud of his decades of work at the shipyard. He wore his cur purpura, his Purple Heart, on a chain around his neck, but it was rare for him to talk about it. His memories of Vietnam were painful, and he preferred to focus on the present, on the work at hand. Still, the burden of age had caught up with him. The heavy lifting that once felt easy now seemed almost impossible. Tasks that had been second nature, Lifting crates, carrying metal beams, repairing ships, were no longer done without great effort. The pain in his back was a constant reminder that the years had caught up with him. Yet, Alex continued. He never complained, never asked for help, at least not unless it was absolutely necessary. And that, Eddie noticed, was part of the problem. It wasn't that Alex wasn't capable, it was just that he was too proud to admit when he couldn't do something. He would try to lift the heavy boxes, struggling with every motion, but he refused to stop, even when the pain was evident in his face. Eddie, busy with his own tasks, couldn't understand it. Why didn't he just ask for help? Eddie thought.
He's too old to be doing this.
One afternoon, things came to a head. The shipyard was crowded with workers rushing to meet a deadline. The sun beat down relentlessly, and the air was thick with humidity. Eddie was moving quickly, hauling a load of metal pipes to a different section of the yard, eager to finish the task so he could take a quick break. As he passed by, he noticed Alex once again struggling with a large metal crate. Alex had bent down to lift it, but his back betrayed him. He grunted with the effort, but the box was too heavy, and it slipped from his hands, crashing to the ground with a loud bang. Eddie glanced up, but didn't stop. He heard the noise, but dismissed it as nothing more than part of the workday. He's fine, Eddie thought. He'll figure it out. But then something unexpected happened. As Alex stooped to pick up the box again, his bag, which was slung over his shoulder, fell open, and something small and metallic slipped out. The object hit the ground with a soft clink, rolling just a few feet away. Eddie stopped in his tracks. He recognized what it was immediately: a purple heart, the small, gleaming metal that symbolized a soldier wounded in combat. The sight of it startled him. He hadn't expected to see it there, especially not now, not like this. He stood frozen for a moment, staring at the metal lying in the dust. Alex, not noticing Eddie's hesitation, bent down to retrieve it. The motion was slow, careful. But Eddie was no longer just an observer. Something inside him stirred, a feeling of discomfort, of realization that he couldn't quite name. The purple heart had a weight to it, more than just metal. It was a symbol of sacrifice, of pain, of a life lived through unimaginable circumstances. Eddie had always seen Alex as an old man, someone past his prime. But now, with that metal in the dirt, Alex was something else entirely. The weight of that small piece of metal seemed to bring the two of them together in a way that Eddie hadn't anticipated. As Alex picked up the metal, Eddie's heart began to race. He had been so quick to dismiss Alex's struggle, so certain that he was just another old man too stubborn for his own good. But now, seeing that metal, knowing what it represented, Eddie couldn't help but feel ashamed. He had been so focused on his own strength, his own capabilities, that he had never stopped to consider the things Alex had endured, the sacrifices he had made. Eddie stood there, a silence hanging between them. It was only after a few moments that he finally moved, kneeling to pick up the metal and return it to Alex, though he wasn't sure what to say. Eddie had always been focused on one thing: success. In the shipyard, that success had a very specific shape. It wasn't about promotions, though that was nice. It wasn't about recognition, though it came in spades. Eddie's desire, the force that drove him forward, was more fundamental than that. It was the relentless pursuit of being the best, the strongest, the fastest, the one who could carry more weight, handle the toughest tasks, and do so without breaking a sweat. There was no room for weakness in Eddie's world. He had built a reputation for being the guy who could handle anything thrown his way, and that was all he cared about. On the surface, Eddie's success was a product of his physical abilities, his muscular frame and fast reflexes, but beneath that, there was something deeper, something harder to see.
It was about proving something.
About showing everyone around him that he was more than just a man working in a shipyard. He wasn't some average, run-of-the-mill laborer who would one day grow old, unable to keep up. No, Eddie was different. He was destined for more, for something bigger. The shipyard was just a stepping stone, a place to solidify his dominance before he moved on to bigger, better things. At least, that's what he liked to tell himself. But deep down, Eddie knew something that he couldn't quite admit, even to himself. The thing he wanted, the thing that had been propelling him forward all these years, wasn't really success. It wasn't money. It wasn't recognition. It wasn't even power. What Eddie wanted, more than anything, was validation. He wanted to be seen, to be acknowledged as more than just another worker. He wanted to matter. Eddie was afraid that if he slowed down, if he stopped to reflect, he would become just like everyone else around him, lost to time and forgotten. He didn't want to become invisible. And so, he pushed harder, faster, stronger. Every lift, every task, every move he made was another step in the race against time, against the inevitable march of age and obscurity. It wasn't until the day Alex's purple heart fell out of his bag that Eddie began to realize how far he had gone off course. Up until that point, Eddie had dismissed the older workers in the yard, Alex included, as relics of a bygone era. To Eddie, their stories were just that, stories. He didn't care for them, didn't see the point. They were nothing more than distractions from the real work, from the job that needed to get done. But in that moment, as the small, gleaming metal lay on the ground, Eddie was forced to pause, forced to reckon with the idea that there were things in this world more important than speed and strength. And with that pause came a shift, albeit a small one. For the first time, Eddie began to question whether his relentless pursuit of validation, of being the strongest, was truly fulfilling. Alex, on the other hand, had lived a life that was rich with meaning and struggle. His journey had been long, full of peaks and valleys, victories and losses. At 70-something, he was a man who had seen much, done much, and given much. But the one thing Alex lacked, the one thing that had eluded him for years, was peace. Alex had always been proud of his service in the Vietnam War. He wore his Purple Heart with pride, a reminder of the sacrifices he had made. But the truth was, Alex had never truly come to terms with the cost of that sacrifice. The war had left scars on him, physical scars, yes, but emotional ones as well. The things he had seen, the things he had done, haunted him. And though he tried to bury them, to push them down into the recesses of his mind, they never stayed buried for long. The memories would come in flashes, sounds, smells, faces, and Alex would find himself lost in them for hours, sometimes days. The shipyard had been his refuge, the place where he could forget. But even here, in the steady rhythm of hard work, the echoes of the past would sometimes creep in. The shipyard had been a place for him to rebuild, to prove to himself that he was still capable, that he could still contribute to the world around him. But despite all the years he had spent here, Alex knew there was something missing. He didn't know what it was, not exactly, but he felt it deep within him, a longing that had been with him for as long as he could remember. He had lived a life full of duty, but now, as he grew older, Alex found himself questioning whether duty alone was enough. Was his life only about work? About keeping his head down, avoiding trouble, and doing what was expected of him?
Or was there more to life than that?
Was it possible that, in his quest to be strong, to be seen as capable and dependable, he had lost sight of something more important, something he couldn't name? The truth was, Alex was lonely. He had never been good at making friends, at connecting with others in any meaningful way. His years in the military, followed by decades of solitary labor, had made him a man of few words, a man who kept to himself. But even in his solitude, Alex couldn't escape the feeling that something was missing. And when he looked around the shipyard, at the younger men who worked alongside him, he realized that he had lost something even more fundamental than friendship. He had lost his sense of purpose. He had given his youth to the war, his strength to the shipyard, but now, at the end of it all, Alex couldn't help but feel that he had given everything and yet received very little in return. He had never asked for much, just enough to get by. But now, in his later years, Alex began to wonder if it had all been worth it. Had his sacrifice, his devotion to duty, been worth the price he had paid? The aches in his back, the pains in his joints, the nights when sleep evaded him. Was it all worth it for the satisfaction of a job well done? Alex didn't know, but he had begun to want more. He wanted to feel like his life had meant something, that his sacrifices hadn't been in vain. He wanted to know that there was more to life than just surviving, than just enduring. He wanted connection, purpose, something that could fill the emptiness he felt inside. And in that desire for something more, Alex had unknowingly found himself at a crossroads. The shipyard had been his refuge, but now it was becoming a cage. The pride he had once felt in his work was slowly being replaced with a quiet dissatisfaction. He didn't know what he was searching for, but he knew that something needed to change. It was in the moments when Alex felt most vulnerable, like when the Purple Heart slipped out of his bag, that he realized how much he had hidden from the world. He had carried that medal with him for so long, not because it reminded him of glory, but because it reminded him of the man he used to be. A man who was strong, proud, and capable. But as the years had passed, that man had become more of a memory than a reality. The truth was, Alex wasn't sure who he was anymore. He didn't know if he was the soldier, the shipyard worker, or the man he had become. And in those quiet moments, when the weight of his past became too much to bear, Alex found himself questioning everything. Eddie's indifference, his obliviousness to Alex's struggle, had been a reflection of something deeper. Eddie was too focused on his own narrow definition of success to see that there was more to life than the weight he could lift or the speed at which he could work. And Alex, in his own way, had lost sight of the fact that there was more to life than the burdens he carried. Both men were in need of something, they just didn't know what it was yet. And while their desires were different, they were both searching for the same thing: validation, peace, and a sense of purpose. The challenge now would be to find it. Both of them would have to confront their own insecurities, their own fears, and their own pasts before they could ever hope to move forward. The question was whether they would be able to recognize that their desires were not separate, but intertwined, whether they could find common ground and, in the process, discover something much more profound than they had ever imagined. The day began like any other at the Charleston shipyard. The sun was already rising high in the sky, its oppressive heat radiating down on the workers below. The heavy air was thick with humidity, a constant reminder that the day was going to be long and arduous. The workers, familiar with this rhythm, moved mechanically. The routine was simple and predictable. They arrived early, did their work, and left when the job was done. There was little room for deviation. Everything had its place, and everyone had their role to play. Eddie, as usual, was already at the center of the action, leading the charge. His broad shoulders and muscular frame cut through the crowd, and he moved with purpose, his every step exuding confidence. He had long since mastered the art of multitasking, of jumping from one task to the next without missing a beat. Lifting crates, directing the cranes, welding seams, it was all in a day's work for him. He had earned the respect of the younger crew, and he made it clear, with every movement, that he was the one in charge. On this particular morning, Eddie was overseeing the unloading of a large shipment of metal parts that had come in for repairs. The crates were stacked high on the dock, each one marked with the name of a ship or a repair job that needed to be done. The metal was heavy, and the workers had already started grumbling about the heat, the weight, and the never-ending tasks. But Eddie wasn't listening. He was too focused on his own objectives. The goal was simple: get the work done as quickly and efficiently as possible.
No distractions, no delays.
Eddie had his eyes set on the finish line, and nothing was going to get in his way. As he surveyed the chaos of the yard, Eddie's gaze fell on Alex. The old man was bent over a crate that looked too heavy for one person to manage. Alex had been struggling with the box for a few minutes, trying to shift it into a more manageable position. Eddie, already annoyed by the disruption in the yard's flow, rolled his eyes.
Here we go again, he thought.
What's the old man doing? Doesn't he know he can't handle this anymore? Alex had never been one to ask for help. He had always prided himself on his independence, even as the years began to take their toll on his body. His back, once straight and strong, had begun to bend with the weight of time. His joints ached, and the muscles that had once been the envy of his peers were now stiff and strained. But Alex wasn't about to admit any of that. He would never ask for help, not even when he was clearly struggling. It wasn't in his nature. The last thing he wanted was to be seen as weak, as someone who couldn't pull his own weight. The purple heart around his neck seemed to be a constant reminder to him of what he had endured, of the man he used to be, the man he still tried to be, even if his body no longer cooperated. Eddie watched from a distance, his annoyance growing. He had no patience for people like Alex. The older workers who had spent years in the yard had their routines, but they were slowing down. They were becoming liabilities, not assets. Eddie had no respect for anyone who didn't keep up, and he resented the fact that Alex seemed to think he could still handle the physical labor as if he were in his prime. The box that Alex was struggling with was heavy, too heavy for one person, especially someone of his age. But Eddie wasn't about to get involved. It wasn't his responsibility. However, as he continued to watch, something unexpected happened. Alex, after another failed attempt to lift the box, collapsed. Ed to one knee, his face contorted in pain. The sound of the crate hitting the ground echoed across the yard, and for a moment, there was a silence, a strange, uncomfortable pause in the usual rhythm of the shipyard. Eddie, still watching from the corner of his eye, felt a strange knot form in his stomach. For a brief second, he considered walking over, offering a hand. After all, the crate wasn't going anywhere, and he had a reputation to maintain. Helping an old man wasn't exactly a difficult task, and it would show the others that he was willing to step in when needed. But then, as if by fate, something happened that stopped Eddie in his tracks. As Alex knelt, his bag shifted, and out fell a small, shiny object that rolled across the ground and came to rest a few feet away. Eddie's gaze locked onto it instantly. The object, glinting in the harsh sunlight, was unmistakable. It was Alex's purple heart, the small medal that marked the sacrifices he had made during the Vietnam War. For the briefest moment, Eddie froze. The sight of the medal, gleaming like a beacon in the dust, had an effect on him that he couldn't quite explain. It was as if time slowed down, and suddenly, the noise of the shipyard, the grinding of metal, the hum of the cranes, the shouts of the other workers, all faded into the background. There was only the medal and Alex. Eddie had seen it before, hanging around the older man's neck, but it had never had any real meaning to him. It was just a piece of metal. But now, in that moment, as the medal lay on the ground between them, Eddie felt something stir within him. It was more than just the desire to help. It was as if the medal had unlocked something in Eddie's mind, a question that had been simmering just beneath the surface, but had never quite bubbled up. The question was simple but profound. Who is this man? Eddie's gaze shifted back to Alex. The older man was still kneeling, slowly rising to his feet. He didn't seem to notice the medal on the ground, and Eddie felt a strange tug at his conscience. He could ignore it. He could walk away and continue with his tasks as he always did. But there was something about Alex, about the way he carried himself with a quiet dignity despite the obvious pain in his body, that made Eddie hesitate. It wasn't the first time Eddie had seen Alex struggle. The old man had always moved with a certain slowness in the past few years, but today was different. There was something more desperate about it, something that Eddie hadn't seen before. And for the first time, Eddie wondered if perhaps there was something more to Alex than just the grumpy old man he had always dismissed. Without thinking, Eddie walked over to Alex. He bent down, picked up the purple heart, and held it out to the older man. "Hey, this yours?" he asked, his voice not unkind but with a tone of curiosity that wasn't usually there. Alex looked up, his tired eyes meeting Eddie's. For a moment, there was a flicker of recognition, a flash of something that passed between them, something Eddie couldn't quite name. Alex's hand trembled slightly as he took the medal from Eddie, but he didn't say anything. He simply nodded and tucked it back into his bag. Eddie stood there, awkwardly, unsure of what to do next. There was a shift in the air now, a tension that had never been there before. It was as if the world had just shifted, and Eddie was suddenly aware of the weight of his own indifference. He had always been so quick to judge, so quick to dismiss, but now, for the first time, he saw Alex not as just an old man, but as someone who had lived a life full of experiences that Eddie couldn't even begin to comprehend. And then, as if the moment wasn't heavy enough already, something else happened. Alex, still holding his bag in one hand, placed the other on the crate he had been trying to lift. He didn't ask for help, didn't say a word, but for a split second, Eddie felt the old man's weight shift as he struggled with the box once again. The desperation in his movements was impossible to ignore. It was then that Eddie realized something. Alex wasn't giving up. Despite everything, despite the pain, the fatigue, the weight of the years, Alex wasn't going to quit. There was a fire in him, a determination that Eddie hadn't expected. It was the same fire that had carried Alex through the horrors of war, through decades of hard labor at the shipyard. Eddie's mouth went dry, and for a moment, he wondered if he was about to make a mistake. But then, without thinking, he reached out. He placed his hands on the crate, and together, the two men lifted it, their combined strength making the task easier. In that moment, as the crate was moved into position, something changed. Eddie didn't know it yet, but it was the beginning of a shift in how he saw Alex, and more importantly, how he saw himself. Alex had entered an unfamiliar situation that day, too. In a way, he was used to being overlooked, to being seen as irrelevant. He had become accustomed to being the old man, the one who needed to stay out of the way. But today, in this moment of shared struggle, Alex realized that perhaps there was still something left for him, something more than just fading into the background. And maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to face it alone. The morning that had started so predictably was now marked by a shift. Eddie could feel it in the air, a tension that lingered long after the crate had been moved. The moment with Alex, with the Purple Heart, hadn't been monumental in the way that a world-altering event might be, but it had stirred something deep within Eddie, something that, for the first time in a long while, he couldn't ignore. He went through the motions of his work with a mechanical efficiency that was becoming increasingly familiar, but his mind kept returning to the old man and that damn metal. He didn't understand it. Eddie was used to certainty, to knowing where he stood, to living his life in the fast lane where every decision, every move, had a clear purpose. But that small exchange, that simple act of helping Alex lift the crate, had disrupted everything. He didn't know why it mattered, why it felt so different from the hundreds of other times he'd helped someone in the yard. He had offered help before, of course, but never with this weight behind it. As Eddie moved on to the next job, he tried to dismiss the feeling. "It's nothing," he told himself. "I was just helping the old man. That's all." But no matter how hard he tried to push it down, the feeling kept bubbling up, like a slow simmer in the pit of his stomach. Alex, for his part, wasn't immune to this strange shift either. He had always been independent, always proud of his ability to stand on his own 2 feet, but now, after the crate had been moved, something had changed. The moment when Eddie reached out to help him, when their combined strength shifted the weight of the box, was more than just a physical effort, it was symbolic. It was a crack in the wall Alex had spent years building around himself. He had never relied on anyone for help. To do so would have been a betrayal of everything he stood for, the silent warrior, the self-sufficient veteran who had seen the worst the world could throw at him and survived. But now, in his body's frailness, in the creeping pain in his joints, in the burden of years, Alex had found himself in a position where he couldn't do it alone anymore. The weight of that realization was heavy, and it made Alex feel both ashamed and relieved. It wasn't that he wanted to lean on Eddie or anyone, but something in the act of sharing that weight, if only for a moment, had unlocked something deep within him. He had spent so many years pretending to be fine, to be invincible, but the truth was beginning to break through. He wasn't fine. He wasn't invincible. He was human. And even the strongest of men, even the bravest of soldiers, needed help sometimes. It wasn't an easy realization for Alex to accept. His pride was a fortress, built over decades of hardship and sacrifice. To ask for help, even just to accept it, felt like a betrayal to the very core of who he was. But after that brief moment with Eddie, Alex began to notice the cracks forming in the walls of his own mind. Maybe I don't have to do everything by myself, he thought. Maybe it's okay to let someone else in for once. As the hours passed and the heat of the day intensified, both men felt the weight of their internal struggles begin to manifest in their work. For Eddie, it wasn't just about lifting crates or directing the workers. It was about how he saw the world now. It was as though the shipyard, which had once been a place of pride and power for him, had suddenly become a mirror, reflecting all the things he had been avoiding. The physical labor no longer held the same satisfaction. He could lift heavier crates, sure, but his body had begun to feel the strain. More than that, his mind kept wandering back to that moment when he had helped Alex. It gnawed at him, that thought, that quiet question. What if it's not just about being the strongest anymore? But Eddie couldn't put his finger on what was bothering him. I'm just tired, he told himself. Maybe I'm pushing too hard. Maybe I need a break. The constant pressure to perform, to stay ahead, to be the best, he was starting to wonder if it was all worth it. Deep down, Eddie didn't know what he was chasing anymore. The ambition, the drive, had always been clear. Be the best, be the fastest, be the strongest. But now, after that brief, shared moment with Alex, Eddie was beginning to question whether there was something more he should be looking for. The next time Eddie saw Alex struggling with a task, his first instinct was to walk away. He had other things to do. He had projects to finish, schedules to meet, people to manage. But this time, when he glanced over at Alex, he felt something pull at him, something deeper than obligation or duty. Without really thinking about it, Eddie walked over. The box was heavy again, the same one Alex had tried to lift earlier, but this time, Eddie didn't wait for an invitation. Here, he said gruffly, let me help. Alex looked up, surprised but not resistant. They didn't speak as they worked together to move the crate. It was simple, straightforward, and quiet. Neither of them said anything more than necessary. But as they worked side by side, something shifted again. Eddie could feel the strain in his own body, the muscles that had always been able to handle the hardest tasks beginning to protest. But he pushed through it. For some reason, helping Alex didn't feel like a chore, it felt right. It was as if, in the act of lifting that crate, he was also lifting something from his own shoulders. It wasn't just the physical weight of the box. It was the weight of expectations, of pride, of everything he had been holding onto so tightly. For Alex, it was a quiet kind of revelation. He wasn't used to leaning on anyone, not even Eddie. But as they moved the crate together, the unexpected partnership felt like a small victory. He wasn't just being helped, he was being seen. Eddie had never treated him like a burden before, but today, something was different. Alex didn't know exactly what it was, but he felt it. The weight of his years, the wear and tear on his body, didn't seem so unbearable when someone was there beside him, helping him carry it. In the days that followed, their work continued in this strange, new rhythm. Eddie and Alex didn't talk much about the things that had changed between them, but their interactions were different. Eddie was quieter now, less quick to dismiss the older man's presence. And Alex? Well, he was still struggling with the vulnerability of it all, still trying to reconcile the man he had been with the man he was now becoming. But each time Eddie helped him, each time they moved a crate together or shared a moment of quiet solidarity, Alex felt the walls inside him soften, just a little. It wasn't perfect. Neither man had suddenly become open books, ready to share their deepest fears and hopes. But the simple act of sharing the work, of recognizing that they were both vulnerable in different ways, was changing something in both of them. Eddie's struggle wasn't just physical. Yes, his body was aching, his joints stiff, his stamina not what it once was, but it was the internal struggle that was most profound. The pace he had once maintained so effortlessly was now starting to feel like a treadmill he couldn't step off. And the worst part was, he didn't know what to do about it. The drive to be the best, to outrun time, had always been there, but now it was beginning to feel hollow. Was it really about strength anymore? Was it about lifting more than anyone else? Or was there something else that mattered, something deeper than just muscle and speed? For Alex, the internal battle was quieter, but just as significant. He had always seen himself as a man of action, someone who handled things with his own two hands. But now, the simple act of allowing someone else to help him had shaken him to his core. It wasn't just about the physical assistance, it was about acknowledging his limitations, his humanity. It's okay to need help, he thought. Maybe that's what I've been missing all these years. As the days wore on, both men adapted in different ways. They weren't perfect, nor were they suddenly transformed. But in the shared moments of struggle, of lifting crates together, of walking side by side without words, both Eddie and Alex began to see each other differently. And maybe, just maybe, they were starting to see themselves differently, too. The shipyard hummed with its usual noise, the clatter of tools, the drone of cranes, the clang of metal against metal, and the sharp shouts of men directing the chaos. But to Eddie, everything felt different now. His movements were more deliberate, his gestures slower and more thoughtful. He could feel the change in himself, though he didn't quite understand what it was. The drive to move fast, to push harder, to prove something to everyone around him, it was starting to feel out of place. It was almost as though a switch had flipped, though Eddie was still struggling to grasp what had changed. Since the day he had helped Alex lift the crate, he had begun to pay more attention to the small details of his work, the things he used to take for granted. The smell of the air, the rhythm of his breath as he worked, the way the sunlight hit the steel girders of the ships in dry dock. He had spent so many years focused solely on the end goal, never stopping to appreciate the journey, to enjoy the process. And now he was beginning to realize that maybe the journey was just as important as the destination. But there was still a part of Eddie that clung to the need for achievement, the need to show everyone, especially the younger workers, that he was still the best. He still led the team with authority, still directed the flow of work with the precision he was known for, but now there was a hesitance in his actions. He wasn't sure anymore if this was the path he wanted to continue down. He wasn't sure if he wanted to keep being the hard-nosed leader who dictated everything from the top, or if he wanted to change, to evolve into something else. The pressure of always being the best, of being the one everyone looked to for guidance, was beginning to feel suffocating. It wasn't that Eddie had lost his edge. Far from it. In fact, today he had proven himself once again, lifting a crate that even the younger men had struggled with. His muscles rippled as he moved, sweat dripping from his brow, but there was a satisfaction in his strength, in his power. He was still the best at what he did, no one could argue that. But as he set the crate down with a grunt, he realized something strange. The victory didn't feel as sweet as it used to. It wasn't enough. There was no rush, no adrenaline. The sense of accomplishment was fleeting, like the taste of a drink that had gone warm too quickly. In the distance, Alex was working too, though his movements were slower now. He had never been one to take a break when he could still work. The years had dulled his physical strength, but he wasn't one to acknowledge that weakness openly. He kept at it, lifting boxes, organizing tools, moving crates where he could. His body ached in ways he had long since learned to ignore. But despite the pain, despite the exhaustion that was creeping up on him, there was a subtle pride in his work. He had always believed that if he could keep working, keep contributing, he could maintain his sense of dignity. Even now, even though he was no longer the man he once was, the thought of slowing down felt like surrender. The moment that had shifted between him and Eddie still lingered in his mind. The quiet understanding that had passed between them as they shared the task of lifting the crate had opened something inside Alex. He didn't know what it was exactly, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of connection, a sense of purpose. He wasn't just an old man in the way anymore. He was still valuable, still capable of doing the work. And when Eddie had helped him that day, something in Alex had clicked. Maybe it was okay to ask for help sometimes. Maybe it was okay to admit that he couldn't do everything alone. But as the day wore on, Alex found himself pushing harder. The old habits were still there, the desire to prove that he wasn't done yet, that he could still carry his weight, that he wasn't just a relic of the past. He moved from task to task, lifting crates and pushing carts, refusing to slow down. But deep inside, the exhaustion was mounting. His hands were raw, his back was stiff, and each movement was becoming more and more painful. Still, he didn't stop. The idea of sitting down, of asking for a break, felt like admitting defeat. By late afternoon, Eddie noticed that Alex's pace had slowed considerably. The older man had always worked hard, but now there was something different about it. His movements were labored, his posture bent in a way that suggested he was struggling. Eddie, now more attuned to the subtle signs, couldn't ignore the fact that Alex was pushing himself past his limits. The fact that Alex had allowed himself to be helped the other day was still fresh in Eddie's mind, but seeing him now, so determined to maintain his independence, made Eddie feel conflicted. He had spent years perfecting his own work ethic, pushing himself to be the best, to never show weakness. And seeing Alex, who had been just as driven, if not more, but now visibly suffering from that same kind of drive, made Eddie uneasy. He wanted to help again, wanted to reach out, but He wasn't sure how. He didn't want to offend Alex, didn't want to make him feel like a burden. But the truth was, Eddie was beginning to realize something profound. Just because he was strong, just because he could do the work, didn't mean he should. The false victory Eddie had felt earlier was becoming clearer to him. It wasn't enough to simply prove his strength, to show that he was still the best. That drive had been the only thing keeping him going for years, but now it felt like an empty pursuit. What good was being the best if there was no one to share that victory with? What did it mean to win if the victory didn't make him feel alive, if it didn't bring him closer to the people he cared about? He had everything he could ever want in terms of achievements, except, perhaps, the one thing that mattered most: connection. Alex, meanwhile, was beginning to feel the sting of his own false victory. Every time he pushed himself harder, every time he told himself that he could keep going, that he could do this on his own, he felt a pang of guilt. It wasn't that he didn't want to contribute, it was that he was running out of steam, and he couldn't admit it. He wanted to be the man he had always been, the man who carried the load without complaint, but his body was betraying him. And yet, he couldn't bring himself to stop. The pride he felt in his work was the only thing that kept him going, but it was beginning to feel like a trap. Both Eddie and Alex were in the midst of a false victory, Eddie in his relentless pursuit of strength and achievement, and Alex in his determination to maintain his independence. But neither of them had truly confronted the deeper issue at play: the need for connection, for vulnerability, and for recognizing the limits of their own strength. They had both been so focused on proving their worth, on holding up a facade of invincibility, that they had ignored the toll it was taking on them. Eddie, still watching Alex from across the yard, suddenly felt the weight of his own realization. It wasn't just about being the strongest, it was about being the most human. And that meant admitting when help was needed, when it was okay to share the burden. He had always thought that strength meant doing it alone, that to show weakness was to be less than. But he was beginning to see that true strength lay in acknowledging his limitations, in reaching out, in offering support to others. For Alex, the realization came as a quiet, painful moment. His hands were shaking as he lifted another crate, his back screaming in protest. He had reached his limit, and yet he refused to stop. But as the weight of the crate began to press down on him, he felt his knees buckle. The false victory, the belief that he could still do it all on his own, collapsed in an instant. And in that moment, Alex knew that he had to face the truth. He couldn't keep going like this. He couldn't continue to carry the weight of his own pride. The false victories that Eddie and Alex had each achieved, through strength and stubbornness, had only led them to the brink of something deeper. It wasn't until they faced the consequences of that false victory that they would begin to realize the true value of connection, of vulnerability, and of allowing themselves to rely on each other. The shipyard, always a place of movement, noise, and hard labor, seemed strangely quiet to Eddie that afternoon. The usual hum of activity felt muted, as if the space itself was holding its breath. Eddie stood in the corner of the yard, his hands on his hips, watching the workers go about their tasks. His body, once an instrument of power, now ached in places he hadn't noticed before. It wasn't just the physical pain that gnawed at him, it was the weight of a realization that had begun to settle deep inside him. For the first time in years, Eddie felt his age, not in the gray hairs creeping across his temples or the slight limp he had developed in his left knee, but in his spirit. The drive that had once pushed him relentlessly, the insatiable hunger to be the best, the fastest, the most powerful, it was no longer enough. He had risen through the ranks, had achieved everything he thought he wanted. But now, standing on the edge of the yard, surrounded by the noise of the shipyard, he felt hollow. He had been so focused on lifting weights, lifting crates, lifting his status, that he had forgotten to lift himself, to lift his soul. It was more than just the physical toll that was taking its toll on Eddie now. His body was feeling the consequences of years of abuse. The aches in his joints were becoming more persistent, the tightness in his back a constant companion. He had always pushed through, thinking that strength was about enduring the pain, about working harder than anyone else. But now, after all these years, the pain wasn't just in his body, it was in his mind, too. He realized he had spent so long convincing himself that he could handle everything alone, that he could outwork any problem, that he had lost sight of the truth. No man could do everything on his own forever. As he watched the men around him, he noticed something that gnawed at his insides. The younger workers seemed to be moving with ease, their energy boundless, their movements quick. Eddie could remember a time when he had been just like them, when his body had moved with that same fluid grace. But now, as he shifted his weight from foot to foot, he realized that every motion required more effort. He could feel the strain in his muscles, the stiffness in his bones, the reminder of a body that was no longer what it used to be. He wasn't invincible. He wasn't the strongest. And as much as he wanted to deny it, as much as he tried to ignore the signs, the truth was undeniable. The clock was ticking. The mental toll was harder to ignore. Eddie had spent so many years wrapped up in the pursuit of achievement that he had lost touch with what really mattered: connection, compassion, sharing the load with others. He had been so focused on proving himself to others, on maintaining his status as the toughest guy in the yard, that he had distanced himself from the people who truly mattered. Alex, the old veteran who had started to chip away at the walls Eddie had so carefully built around himself, was now at the center of his thoughts. He had seen the shift in Alex, too. The veteran had always been a solitary figure, proud of his independence, of the battles he had fought and won. But in the last few weeks, something had begun to change. Alex was slower now, more deliberate in his movements. His strength, once unshakable, was now tempered by the reality of his aging body. Eddie had noticed it the day they had moved the crate together. The weariness in Alex's eyes, the pain he tried to hide. The old man was in denial, just as Eddie had been. But unlike Eddie, who could push through his pain with sheer will, Alex's body was beginning to fail him in ways he couldn't ignore.
Eddie had seen it again today.
As Alex had struggled with a crate, his back hunched in a way that made Eddie wince. He had moved towards the veteran, instinctively, wanting to help. But Alex had waved him off, as he always did. The pride in the old man was as strong as ever. But Eddie could see through it now. Alex wasn't just struggling with his body. He was struggling with something deeper, something he wasn't ready to face yet. Eddie could relate. In that moment, something inside Eddie clicked. He could see the cost of Alex's pride, the weight of his refusal to accept help. But more than that, Eddie realized that he had been doing the same thing. He had been so caught up in the pursuit of strength, in the need to prove that he was still capable, that he had neglected the one thing that could have truly saved him: the willingness to be vulnerable, to admit that he couldn't do it alone, that he didn't have to carry every burden by himself. He had never been willing to open up, to ask for help, to share the load with someone else. He had been running on empty for too long, and now, the consequences were catching up with him. It wasn't just physical, either. Eddie's relationship with the other workers had become strained. He had always been a leader, the one everyone looked up to, the one who called the shots. But in his relentless drive to prove himself, he had isolated himself from those around him. The younger workers respected him, but they didn't truly know him. He had become a figure, a symbol of strength, but not a person they could connect with. The old camaraderie he had once shared with the other men was gone. They no longer saw him as a peer, but as an untouchable figure, a man who never let his guard down. And as Eddie stood there, watching them, he realized that this was the price of his isolation, the price of his pride. Meanwhile, Alex had reached a breaking point. It wasn't just the physical strain that was wearing him down, it was the weight of the years, the burden of a life lived in isolation, of battles fought alone. Every ache in his body, every moment of weakness, was a reminder of what he had lost. He had spent his life avoiding weakness, avoiding vulnerability, and now, as his body betrayed him, he found himself in a battle he couldn't win. Alex had always prided himself on his independence. He had survived wars, fought battles, and lost friends. He had earned the right to be self-sufficient. But now, as his body aged and his strength faded, he couldn't ignore the fact that he needed help. The thought of admitting it, though, was unbearable. It would mean giving up his sense of identity, admitting that he wasn't the man he once was. He had built his entire life around the belief that he could stand on his own, that he could survive without anyone's help. But that belief was beginning to crumble. The moment came when Alex could no longer deny it. He had spent the entire morning working through pain, lifting crates, bending over, twisting his body in ways that made him wince. His hands were raw, his back aching with every movement. But he refused to stop. He refused to let anyone see how much he was struggling. But as the afternoon wore on, it became clear. He couldn't keep going. The pain in his back was sharp now, shooting down his legs. His breath came in short bursts, and his hands shook uncontrollably. He bent over to lift another crate, but this time, something gave way. His legs buckled, and he fell to his knees, the pain coursing through him like fire. For the first time in years, Alex felt completely vulnerable, completely helpless. It wasn't the physical pain that crushed him, it was the realization that he couldn't continue on his own. He had spent so long hiding his pain, hiding his weakness, that now it was too much to bear. He had reached the end of his rope, and there was no way out. Eddie, who had been watching from across the yard, saw Alex collapse. Without thinking, he rushed over to him, his heart pounding in his chest. As he knelt beside the older man, he saw the look in Alex's eyes, the look of a man who had finally admitted defeat. It was a look Eddie knew well, but one he had been too afraid to face in himself. "Alex," Eddie said quietly, his voice filled with concern, "let me help you." For a moment, Alex didn't say anything. He just looked at Eddie, his face etched with pride and pain. But then slowly he nodded. And for the first time in years, Alex allowed someone to help him. The shipyard had always been a place of noise, motion, and determination. For years, Eddie had navigated its aisles and docks with a confidence that came from a sense of superiority. He was the one who knew how to get things done, the one who pushed everyone else to do more. But today, as he stood among the bustling workers, watching the cranes lift massive sheets of steel into place, he felt something different. It wasn't a sense of power or control, it was humility, a quiet, unfamiliar hum in his chest. The lessons he had learned over the past few weeks were still fresh in his mind. They felt like pieces of armor, giving him the courage to move forward with a new mindset. It wasn't the physical strength that made him the best. It wasn't the speed with which he could finish a task. It was the capacity for connection, for collaboration, for recognizing that no man, no matter how strong, could succeed without the support of others. That was the truth Eddie had once resisted, but now it was something he embraced. As he walked through the yard, he noticed something that struck him more than anything. The workers around him no longer seemed like distant figures. They weren't just faces to him, part of the machine that kept the shipyard running. They were people, each with their own strengths, weaknesses, and stories. There was a subtle shift in his perception. He no longer looked at them as individuals to be outworked or outpaced. He saw them as partners. In that, Eddie understood a profound truth about leadership. It was not about commanding from above, but walking beside others, acknowledging their worth and their humanity. He had learned this lesson through Alex, the stubborn, proud veteran who had once seemed to Eddie like little more than a relic of the past. But through the quiet moments they had shared, lifting crates together, swapping stories, Eddie had come to see Alex not just as an old man in need of help, but as someone with wisdom far beyond his years. Alex, despite his pride, had shown Eddie that it was okay to lean on others, to ask for help when needed. Now, as Eddie moved through the shipyard, he was keenly aware of the weight of his new perspective. He understood that vulnerability didn't make a man weak, it made him stronger. He understood that asking for help and offering help in turn was not a sign of failure, but a sign of growth. The old Eddie, the one who had pushed through every obstacle with sheer force, was gone. In his place was someone who knew that strength came in different forms, not just physical, but emotional, relational, and even spiritual. His first encounter with one of the younger workers, Marco, came as a reminder of just how far he had come. Marco, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 20s, had always looked up to Eddie, but Eddie had never been able to connect with him. Marco was fast, efficient, and constantly trying to prove himself, just like Eddie once had. But now, Eddie saw Marco in a new light. He noticed the tension in the younger man's shoulders, the way he rushed through tasks with little regard for the well-being of his fellow workers. "Hey, Marco," Eddie called out as he approached him during a brief break. "You're pushing yourself too hard. Don't burn out." Marco, surprised by Eddie's comment, looked up. "I'm just trying to get it done, you know? The quicker we finish, the sooner we can go home." Eddie nodded, but there was something in Marco's eyes that made him pause. The younger man was driven, yes, but also scared. Scared of failing, scared of being seen as weak. Eddie had been there once. "I get it," Eddie said quietly. "But listen, strength isn't just about how fast you go. It's about pacing yourself, knowing when to ask for help, when to let someone else step in." Marco blinked, taken aback by the unusual advice. "I guess I never thought about it that way." Eddie smiled and placed a hand on Marco's shoulder. "You're stronger than you think when you're not trying to do it all alone." Marco nodded slowly, and Eddie saw the flicker of understanding in his eyes. It was a small moment, but it was a significant one. Eddie had never been one for long speeches or deep philosophical musings. But this was something he had learned the hard way. He realized now that sometimes sharing the load, being there for someone else, was the most powerful thing a person could do. Eddie's thoughts drifted back to Alex. After their shared moments of vulnerability, after Alex had finally allowed him.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.